Hello early modernists, welcome to this video where we're going to be giving a brief introduction to early modern philosophy and answering some basic questions about it. What is this tradition concerned with? Who is included in this tradition? And why are we reading this lineage of philosophical authors in particular in this class? And why is this class so important for the way that philosophy is generally done today? I mentioned in the syllabus video that early modern philosophy is considered both really foundational to the discipline. It's a necessary class for the major. It's the only class for the major that's non-negotiable. It's the course that is the requirement for entering into the most upper level coursework. And what you'll find if you look at philosophy departments across the country is that they basically all have this early modern philosophy requirement. Now, that raises the question, why, right? Like, why are we reading specifically this period of philosophical inquiry, which is roughly equivalent to a span of authors that's called From Descartes to Kant? Why are we reading them? Why are we reading European philosophy from roughly 1641 to 1781 rather than European philosophy from 1300 to 1400, or African philosophy from 600 to 800, or Chinese philosophy from 200 BC to 100 BC, or something like that, right? What in particular makes this span of philosophical thinking so vitally important to the way that philosophy is done today? Now, in this video, I'm going to try to give an answer to this question and also contextualize my answer in terms of basic facts about European history of the times. First of all, I would like to clarify that early modern philosophy can refer to a plurality of different kinds of philosophy that you can do, right? By that I mean you can be talking about, for example, ethics or social and political philosophy, or you can be talking about philosophy of science, or you can be talking, for example, about metaphysics, right? But in our class, the three major topics that we're going to be dealing with that we identify as sort of the core of early modern philosophy are metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. Now, metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality. So what is the basic stuff of the universe, right? We know what things look like from my perspective and from your perspective, but what are things like ultimately? That's the question that motivates metaphysics as an endeavor. Epistemology is a region of inquiry concerned with what it is that we can know and how it is that we can know it. So, for example, is there an external world outside of my own minds and ideas? And if so, how can I know that? Are there other people, for example, outside of my perceptions of them? And how do I know that? And when and in what circumstances are my perceptions of the world reliable? When are they liable to error? And when can I confidently choose to rely on them? These are the sorts of questions that we are going to be investigating in this class, alongside what we call philosophy of mind, which is a really vital and interesting and important topic nowadays, especially because of the rising prominence of artificial intelligence. What is the nature of my mind? Is my mind the same thing as my brain? Is it a physical reality? Is it a non-physical reality? If it is a non-physical reality, what kind of reality is that, right? These are the sort of questions that are interrogated in philosophy of mind. Now, the tradition of early modern philosophy has a lot of important things to say about other topics. For example, especially social and political philosophy. A lot of the core political tenets of modern societies, modern democracies especially, that we live in today, those principles were originally formulated by very many of the same authors that we're going to be discussing in this class. However, if you're interested in that topic, then I would highly encourage you to take Philosophy 371, Classical Political Philosophy. The way that our courses are set up divides these topics so that this course deals with what we would think of as perhaps more core philosophical issues, more fundamental philosophical issues, and that class deals with the question of political society and how best we can get along with one another. So we've clarified at this point that the main thing that we're concerned with are the metaphysical, epistemological, and philosophy of mind style questions that occupy a span of thinkers during European thought that runs roughly from 1641 to 1781, right? But even though we've clarified a little bit of the trajectory of thinkers that we're going to be discussing, we still haven't really gotten into the why of it all, right? And getting into the why of it all, I think, is going to require some background investigation for what's taking place within European society of this time. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of our time today doing, and using the Pierre Bayle that I assigned you to read as an example of that dynamic. Now, I think what we see during the period of the emergence of early modern philosophy is really complicated interplay between religion, science, and philosophy. It's going to take us essentially all semester to be able to unpack that thesis, right? We're going to get more and more detailed view of what exactly that means. But for now, let's just say that in essence, what's going on is the birth of the scientific revolution, right? What we have just immediately prior to the birth of early modern philosophy is the emergence of the scientific revolution in the works of Copernicus and Galileo, right? We're going to be reflecting on the transformational change that these ideas introduced into European society. But to get a sense of that, just to start out, we need to compare what it's like to think about the world from a pre-Copernican / Galilean natural scientific viewpoint to a post-Copernican natural scientific viewpoint. Which means, I think, basically identifying the distinction between a kind of religious, theological conception of the universe and a natural scientific conception of the universe. Before Copernicus and Galileo, our astronomy generally maintained that the Earth was the center of the solar system, and indeed the center of the universe as a whole. Human beings were created in God's image, according to this traditional Christian religious conception, and God's moral purposes are realized on Earth, right? Not in any of the other planets, right? That seem to orbit our own planets. The view that the Earth is the center of the universe is not only a kind of natural scientific thesis, right? It's also a moral statement. It's to say, in a way, that what is of central importance to the universe, the reason the universe was created, the purpose that the universe fulfills, is found here on Earth within human society, and particularly the purposes that humans make of nature. So really, the entirety of the universe is, in a way, created. It's created by an intelligent and benevolent creator, God, who created the universe this way in order to serve moral purposes, in order to make it good for the stewardship of human beings. This is not only a thesis about planets and how planets move and so on, right? It's a view of what the universe is like, what it is that we're meant to do, how it is that everything works, right? It's a holistic conception of the entire world, right? The entire universe, even. And what happens with Copernicus and Galileo is the gradual destruction of this worldview, right? Why is that the case? Because what Galileo and Copernicus discover, in essence, is that our universe is not governed by teleology. In other words, it's not designed to serve certain kinds of purposes and structured to fulfill that purpose, right? The reason why there's trees is not so that we can breathe. The reason why there are cows, for example, is not for human beings to eat, right? Instead, the universe is governed by what they would call efficient causal or mechanical relationships. In other words, if you want to know about the universe, what you really need to study is mathematics. Mathematics and not theology tells you about the universe and how the universe works and why it does what it does. The creation of the telescope and the charting of the orbits of the planets, right? These are important not only because they give us more accurate models for astronomy, which was important for navigation, it was important for religious purposes, it was important for a myriad of reasons, but also because it overturned the entire conception of how the universe works, right? And so, just to give you a big picture overview of what I think is going on with early modern philosophy, is you have this old religious tradition on the one hand that had withstood thousands of years of change and conflict. It survived through the Middle Ages, it survived through the falling of the Roman Empire and so on, right? Into an emerging natural scientific viewpoint. Now, of course, it doesn't come all at once, right? It's not as if Copernicus or Galileo had completely abandoned all of their old worldview. But what we can see is, in a way, the very gradual unfolding of an entirely new perspective or viewpoint that we can come to have on the universe, which is a natural scientific standpoint on that universe, right? And this is of particular relevance to us today because we still live within the natural scientific standpoint that was discovered and, in a sense, elaborated by the early modern tradition, especially the tradition of early modern philosophy. So, what we get during this period is a kind of constant conflict, a battle between a religious conception of the world, a scientific conception of the world, and philosophers who are doing their best to, in a way, either synthesize or advocate for one of these viewpoints over the other, right? These philosophers essentially come onto the scene after the fact, after the conflict takes place, and try to understand what it is that this conflict means for us, right? Who should we agree with and why? So let's get a little bit more context. I've written up here 3 timelines, right, of sort of like religion, Christian religion within European societies running from 1500 to 1800, some natural scientific revolutionary occurrences during this time, and then the sequence of philosophers that we are reading together. Okay? Let's look at the religious timeline first. What we see at the beginning of the 16th century is the beginning of the Protestant Revolution, right? In 1517, Luther posted his theses, and already by 1520, he was excommunicated and, released his own version of the Bible, right? So what we can see here is that there's already a kind of fragmentation within Christianity itself into Catholicism and Protestantism. This is going to be a constant conflict that defines not only European politics but also European philosophy for the next several hundred years. In 1600, Giordano Bruno, a philosopher, was burned at the stake for his heretical views, right? So just like Martin Luther was excommunicated, right, so too Giordano Bruno was also punished for his heterodox philosophical beliefs. And just to give you an example of how rocked the politics of early modern Europe was by these events, the 30 Years' War running from 1618 to 1648. This was a religious conflict that involved many of the central powers in Central Europe, and it was absolutely destructive, right? And this sort of characterizes early modern European politics generally, is you have all of these lords, right? A lord will own a certain territory. They will be Catholic or Protestant, and therefore essentially force all the people within their territory to be Catholic or Protestant. There will be civil and religious conflict. That lord might be ousted, right? If that lord was a Catholic, he'd be ousted by a Protestant or vice versa. And then, all the people there are now expected to convert once again, right? So it's a period of intense turmoil, intense civic conflict, right? This is a period that historian Paul Hazard called the crisis of the European mind. And we're going to get a little bit more on why that's the case in just a moment, right? But it's important to note that this is not just a religious conflict. And to see that, let's move to our second timeline, which is natural science, right? In 1543, Copernicus developed his heliocentric model of the solar system. And around 1610 is where we get really the first fully fleshed out version of Galilean astronomy. This is the emergence of that natural scientific worldview, structuring not only the planets but also our own world, right? An entirely new perspective way of viewing not only other planets but also ourselves and our place within the universe. Galileo was put on house arrest for propagating this view, right? It was viewed by the church as extremely dangerous. But it's important to note that it's not as if there's like philosophy on the one hand and natural science on the other. During this period, one of the remarkable features of early modern philosophy is that a lot of the early modern philosophers actually were scientists, right? They were scientists and they were theologians. In other words, they had a view about the nature of God. They had a view about how natural science worked and proposed theories within natural science. And they had their own philosophy, their own metaphysical principles that informed both their religious and scientific views. And a good example of that is Descartes' discovery in 1637 of analytic geometry. So you might recall the Cartesian coordinate plane, right? Those annoying graphs that you would do in middle school and high school, where you would chart out algebraic equations geometrically. Descartes, one of the main philosophers that we're going to be discussing Descartes for about 4 weeks. He discovered that as a method. He discovered that you can express algebraic sentences geometrically, right? And that was a very, very important discovery for the progression of mathematics and engineering, right? Very, very important, right? And it's about 50 years afterwards, in 1687, that we get essentially the perfected form of that Copernican Galilean viewpoint with the discovery of Newtonian mechanics, right? So this is the system of physics that essentially works almost perfectly for what we could call medium-sized objects. So not quantum objects, not objects as large as a star or something to that effect, right? But for most medium-sized objects within the universe, Newtonian mechanics can perfectly predict and describe the behavior of those objects. And that is extraordinary. It's extraordinarily powerful as a system of physics, as a way of explaining physical interactions and behaviors at a certain scale. We later discovered, of course, that Newtonian mechanics is not absolutely perfect, and he doesn't describe the physical interactions of everything at every level of scale. But it's incredibly remarkable just how much better Newtonian mechanics works for explaining the behavior of physical objects than anything that has come before him, right? And related to that, another discovery within mathematics that is absolutely essential for the development of engineering, calculus. Around 1690, there's a dispute between Newton, who was himself a kind of philosopher, and a philosopher that we're going to be discussing a lot, Leibniz. There was a dispute about who discovered calculus. They each at least appeared to discover calculus entirely independently of one another, right around the same period of time, and each of them independently wanted to take credit for that invention. So some of you might have heard that calculus was discovered by Newton, other of you might have heard that it was discovered by Leibniz, and probably some smaller portion of you might have heard that it was discovered in essence by both of them, right? So I just want us to note that within the span of like really about 150 years, we get Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, right, and calculus, all within this very, very short span of time. Our ability to predict and model physical interactions went from very, very limited prior to Copernicus to marvelous, at least by comparison afterwards, right? So it's a period of intense scientific revolution during this period, right? And what happens afterwards is you notice that there's kind of lag, right? These religious disputes take place, these scientific disputes take place, and slightly after them, philosophy comes onto the scene. Philosophy, in a way, always comes to history late, right? It comes as an observer of someone who has seen this process play out, this conflict between natural science and religion, and is an effort to resolve the conflict, or at least to understand it. And so I bring here a number of the central texts that we're going to read to each other. I mentioned before briefly that early modern philosophy is roughly equivalent to the philosophical tradition running from Descartes to Kant. Descartes wrote the central text of his work, the one that we're going to be spending the most time reading, his Meditations, in 1641. A little over 30 years later, we have the next sort of classic within that genre, Spinoza's Ethics, right? We're going to understand eventually that these are both rationalist texts. They both reflect very similar points of view, or at least manners of proceeding, right? And we're going to get a sense for how and why that's the case, right? John Locke wrote his essay concerning human understanding in 1789. Leibniz then wrote his Monadology in 1711. Hume, a very important empiricist philosopher, wrote his essay concerning human understanding in 1740. And Kant's Critique of Pure Reason was written in 1781. Now, right now, we don't really have the tools to think through how these texts relate to one another, how they relate to this time period and this history, right? But what I want you to get a sense of is really just how compressed this timetable really is. We see a number of incredibly remarkable philosophical texts being written one after another during this period in a way that you do not see otherwise in the history of philosophy, aside from some extraordinary periods. And moreover, that it clearly seems to follow some of the conflicts that take place in religion and natural science. I want to end our video today by discussing the reading that I had you do, which was from Pierre Bayle. Pierre Bayle was a historian, or at least he called himself a historian, even though he wrote about very many philosophical topics. And this essay is really interesting because it's something that maybe you wouldn't expect a philosopher or a historian to write about. It's about a comet that took place in the year 1680. His the piece that you read, various thoughts on the occasion of a comet, came out in 1782, so right afterwards. Now, how does this comet piece exemplify this dynamic? Well, it's quite interesting. The comet that took place in 1680 was taken by the general public to be a sign from God, right? A sign from God that they had to interpret. God sent us, human beings, a comet. Was it a show of his wrath? Was it a show of his pride or his happiness with the human race, right? And there's this explosion of literature around 1680, just going through various kinds of interpretations of what it is that the comet might mean about how God felt about the society of the times. Bayle's intervention is very, very interesting because it speaks directly to this dynamic between religion, science, and philosophy, right? Bayle wants to say in this essay, first of all, that everyone is wrong to interpret the comet as a sign, right? That's what we learn from natural science, is that cosmological phenomena, so things like comets, asteroids, and the like, those have entirely natural and not supernatural explanations, right? That's a very kind of simple, straightforward argument, right? But here's where things get interesting. Bayle introduces this next level, and he says, and, you know, I'm not speaking just from the perspective of godless, scientific atheist, you know, something of that kind. Instead, he says, and I'm going to put forward something even more powerful. I'm going to give you a theological argument for why the comet can't be a sign, which is that if the comet was a sign, then God would be encouraging idolatry, right? What does that mean? Well, it means that if God were to try to communicate a message in this way, then God, in essence, according to Bayle's argument, wouldn't be a good God, right? God would be encouraging you to interpret the whole world as if it were governed by these spiritual kind of behaviors, right? And that's a way of elevating that above the position of God. If you want to think of God correctly, like a Christian would, according to Bayle, then you really have to believe that God created the universe to be orderly. It created the universe to make sense. It created the universe in such a way that we could know and potentially understand it. Whereas if it were governed by the supernatural phenomena, then God would be encouraging sort of overly enthusiastic supernatural mysticism, which actually leads you towards paganism and away from genuine Christianity, right? And so Bayle's argument is interesting because it is an argument that depends on the natural scientific revolution, but it is also a kind of religious Christian argument about how it is that you have to think that God behaves if you're a Christian and not a pagan on his account, right? And so the component of the various thoughts on the occasion of the comet that I provided to you, here, in essence, what Bayle says is the following. He says that there's no really good, actually religious reason to think that God communicates to human beings using signs in nature, such as like a comet or, something to that effect, right? He says the only real evidence that we have for that is the fact that people have believed that in the past, right? The most compelling evidence that someone who wants to interpret the comet as a sign from God really has is to point at the history of human beings doing exactly that for thousands of years, right? And it is a fact, and it's a fact that Bayle recognizes that comets are interpreted as signs of God, either positive or negative, for thousands of years of human history prior to this. But what Bayle says here is, I think, incredibly remarkable and very, very interesting. He says, and this is what ties him to that point I made about Paul Hazard and the crisis of the European mind. What he says is all of those traditions, all of those people who thought all of those things, that thousands of years of history of interpreting the comets as a sign are worth nothing. Or rather, they are only worth as much as the reasons of the people who had to believe them. So in other words, the fact that over the course of human history, millions of people have interpreted comets as a sign for nature, as a sign within nature of God's intention, Bayle says, counts for nothing, right? The only thing that counts is the reasons they had for believing that, which are weak on his account, right? They're weak both natural scientifically, but they're also weak religiously or theologically, right? And I think this really speaks to, as I was mentioning, that crisis of the European mind moment, right? What Bayle is saying here is that the entire eons of human traditions at this point, now that we have natural science, now that we have the means to discover how these processes work, count for nothing. Right? In other words, we have to totally rethink, we have to totally reorient our conception of the universe in light of this. And we have to think as philosophers to whether we need to accept conventional religious doctrines such as the existence of God, the existence of soul, the existence of morality independent of the world, right? And reevaluate them completely. That is an extremely radical claim, and in my view, it's the nature of the Enlightenment. We are no longer judging things from the standpoint, the authority of tradition. Now, for us, within early modern philosophy, within the beginnings of the Enlightenment, that tradition counts for nothing. Instead, now we evaluate everything purely from what these authors would call the light of reason. So in other words, we will only accept beliefs if they appear rational to us. It is no longer sufficient for there to be a religious tradition, a theological tradition, a common sense tradition, anything of that nature. We need a radical reevaluation of all of human knowledge up to this point. And that is exactly what we're going to see in our next sequence of videos, where we discuss Descartes' meditations on first philosophy. I very much look forward to continuing this discussion for you and hearing what you have to say in the discussion forums.